bad to be sad, necessarily. Sad might be a perfectly okay emotion given one's life situation. Yeah. It's really complicated. Now, another comment on this emotion regulation point. These are data from the longitudinal study of generations. Some of you must have encountered the longitudinal study of generations. So this is giving the affect balance scale to people. And this is following one age group longitudinally, and then another age group longitudinally, and then another age group longitudinally. And what you see is that endorsement of positive affect doesn't drop off much with age. But what happens with age is there's a reduction and then a leveling off of endorsement of negative affect. So what with age people seem to learn to do is not be quite as kicked around as much by events and be just a little bit less reactive and to manage affect. And this would then go into how come, if you can do that, this might be protective against becoming depressed, given lousy things happening. So I'm going to now come to paradox number 2, which we alluded to in our introduction. We'll come back to now. So major depression shows this inverted U-shaped function over adulthood, where the lowest rates of depression are in older adults. This is major depressive disorder, typical shape. And self-report scales of depressive symptoms tend to show a different shape, a U shape, not an inverted U, but a U. So this would be a community sample taking the CESD. And we've talked about this. The discrepancy between this high and this low, that's that area of the subsyndromal symptoms. But we'll talk about this for a little bit more. Now, one more picture. This is putting together a ton of different studies. And we just begin with these, and we can add more to the picture. If you draw results from everybody's studies of CESD scores, some people don't have the upward bend at the end, some have more of an upward bend at the end, some people only have part of the age range. But if you squint, you've got a pretty definite function going on. And what's a little interesting then is if we break down the depressive symptoms into groups, the mood symptoms, the psychomotor retardation symptoms, those are the sort of somatic ones, but also the can't get going. So it's appetite and sleep, but it's also I can't get going. And lack of well-being, that's I am happy scored in reverse fashion, is that the lack of well-being is a huge contributor to why there's that U-shaped function. So it's the failure to endorse happiness that in some ways is driving up the scores. And it wasn't just, and that we found that was longitudinal study of generations data, but you read an article that had this in it too for today, where below age 70, CESD scores are remarkably stable longitudinally. So this is from the Baltimore longitudinal study. And where there were age-related changes, they found them also on the lack of well-being items, and they found them on somatic items, whereas in what I showed you from Margot Hurwitz in our data, we did not find that. But depressed mood is not bouncing up with age. The change is being driven by other things. Now, the other point made in this article, again, this is one of my favorite drums to beat. is that people who have comorbid physical illness will have higher depressive symptoms. But the comorbid physical illness doesn't explain the age differences or the age trends. Everybody who's sick has worse CESD symptoms. But older people are more likely to be sick. But it's not affecting older people in a different way. And so the point being that the fact older adults have physical illnesses is not a threat to the validity of using the CESD scale. And I know that disagrees with Boris Scoggins' article in the US. Now, back to our two curves. So here's our major depressive curve. Here's our CESD curve. Now, two different groups of researchers performed what I find to be a marvelous exercise, where they took predictors of depression and covariated them out and looked at what happened to the CES curve. So here's just the crude curve. This is what happens with CESD symptoms over age, and these are the two folks who've done this exercise. So then, let's remove the effects of some of the just basic demographics, marriage and income, SES. And then what will happen is that lowers the rate in older adults, CESD score. The average score goes down once you've adjusted for marriage and for income. So we can do this again. Let's adjust for chronic illness and for functional disability. Oh my goodness. That's, yeah, okay. Well, let's adjust for social support. Wow. And finally, Murawski adjusted for perceived control. And lo and behold, what you start getting is, but what we don't have is adjustment in younger adults. So I'm going to bet you, if you did this adjustment over the whole lifespan, you could turn the U into the upside down U, basically. So the suggestion then is that there's less of a paradox than there probably appears about the difference between what the CESD scores look like over age and the major depressive disorder over age. So in talking then more about age and depression, this would summarize to point out that age is not, in fact, a risk factor for major depression. In fact, we saw with major depressive disorder that older adults have less of it. And again, the footnote that this should not minimize the seriousness of depression when it does occur, and it should not minimize the seriousness of depressive symptoms. They are consequential. And then we would ask, so I've suggested risk and protective factors might have differences with age. Well, to some extent, the same things do lead to depression at all ages. So physical illness is going to be correlated with depressive symptoms at all ages. But if we look at the presentation, in fact, probably depression in older adults is quite different in terms of the things that lead to depression. And I think it's because of taking this lifespan perspective. So one arrives at old age with a history of managing things in one's life that folks younger in their lives do not have. One also arrives in old age with whatever wear and tear one brings physically, and one arrives in old age encountering things that are happening that have never happened to you before in your life. Loved ones have died, but not at the rate. That rate starts picking up really big time in old age. And in particular, given that we're looking at a difference in the presentation of depression in old age,